Okay, I'm sitting here in an 1850s, 60s log cabin in Southlake, Texas. Originally in 1993, I was called in by the historical group that was formed to come and look at a cabin that's set where Central Market is today. And it was all falling down. There's only about half of it there, but it was a real good, early, well-made cabin at one time. And they wanted to restore it. So I went to the meeting and told them, yes, it can be restored. And I give them an example of Irving. They had a cabin, they only had pieces of 7 logs. And I wound up building a dog trot out of those 7 logs. But anyway, all these years, they've had it in storage, it and a piece of another cabin and a piece of a barn. So I took those 3 log structures and made this one log house out of those 3. The logs in these walls are from 3 different structures, built about the same period of time, all of them, from this local area. But this is a log house. The difference in a log cabin and a log house, a log cabin was a temporary structure that was built just real hurriedly. When the pioneers got to where they was going and settled, they had to hurry up and build something to protect them from the Indians and the wild animals and the weather. So they throwed up a structure right quick, temporary structure. There's not any of those in existence anymore. That's called a log cabin. They usually had a dirt floor. Most of them didn't have any way to cook food with, so they had a campfire in the middle of the dirt floor and had a smoke hole in the roof. That's how they lived, kind of like the Indians, until they had time to build a log house, which this is. And the city of Southlake brought all the pieces of those logs to my farm. I went through them and found enough good logs to make the wall and part of the floor. Everything else I had to go to the woods and cut trees and lumber and build what you see now. But it's put back exactly the way it originally was. It originally had a shed porch on one side and a floored porch on the other side, and the purpose of those porches were the lady did a lot of her work on the front porch out of the weather, and then the men could haul a wagon up through here and haul in hogs or buffalo or deer or whatever they killed, and they could finish slaughtering that animal under this cover and do all their work. Get blood all over the ground and not have to worry about getting in trouble from their wife. But this house had 2 doors. It had 4 regular windows and 1 little small window, which is by the fireplace. And that was used to put firewood through into the fireplace. And also the lady kept her spinning wheel there and did all her work by the light of that window. Because when this house was built, kerosene wasn't invented. So the only light they had was during the day they come through a window or from the fireplace at night to put out lots of light. But the lady and the men had to hunt and trap, and they had to put up food to make it through the winter, or they didn't eat. There's only 2 things you need in life, and that's water and food. So it was a full-time job, cutting wood for a fireplace, trapping and hunting animals. The lady making clothes, because they could only bring so much stuff with them when they come from wherever they come from. Most settlers in this area come from Missouri or Tennessee or Alabama. And if they're lucky enough to have a wagon, they could bring a wife, the lady of the house could bring a trunk full of a few extra clothes and maybe her family's silverware or a few items like that. But everything else had to be for the man to build a cabin with when he got here and to do farming with, and bring nails, a few things. You couldn't, when you got here, there wasn't anything or anybody around normally. Your nearest neighbor was usually 10 or 15 miles during this period of time. So you couldn't go to a store and buy what you need. You had to make it. And the men would start in, after they got a log house like this one, they'd start in making beds and chairs and tables if they was enough of a craftsman. And they made all their hinges for the doors out of wood. All the plates they eat off of were wood. And the spoons, of course, they didn't have forks back in those days. So they would make spoons out of either wood or a cow horn. Because we had wild cattle that roamed all over this country during that period of time. The longhorns that the Spanish brought several hundred years earlier, or buffalo horns, they would use them. But all the, like the shingles of the roof, they didn't call them shingles, they called them boards. And they always talked about when they got their house boarded, they meant when they got the roof on. They took boards and laid up there for the shingles. And they had to have certain tools to make those boards with, and they would have to bring those with them. One of them was a froe. This is called a froe. You would take a log with a wooden mallet, hit this froe and drive it into the log and twist it and split off boards. You could either do that to make your trim with or to make shingles. And then they would bring saws with them too. This is a small crosscut saw. It took 2 men to operate. Most of the time they were longer than this. But you've heard the expression, it's the pits. Well, where that comes from, they would dig a pit or find a natural ditch. They would roll a log across it, and they had a man down in that pit and one standing on top of that log, one a pulling and one a pushing. And it's the pits. Is that guy in that pit with all that sawdust falling in his face? That's the pits. That's where that sand comes from. And the man on top of the log was a pulling, and they would saw off boards off that log to do the roof with and trim. And then when they built the log house, these logs are flat on 2 sides, inside and out. And how they made those logs flat, they would either use a broad axe and chop it off, or mainly in Texas is what they did. They had a foot adze, this is called an adze, and they would chop that log off flat with this adze. They worked with it between their legs. They would straddle the log and then come down and hit it, chop off that round part to make it flat. And you can see some of the old marks on these logs left from when they did that. You can really see it down here better. Well, then they had to start trapping. They trapped for 2 reasons. Mainly to make clothes out of, and you eat the meat. They'd eat about anything they caught. And then some of them would save the hides up and then yearly make a trip into the nearest town, which might be 150 miles, to sell their hides. So a lot of them would bring traps with them. This is a wolf trap here. They had different sizes, but there were lots of wolves in this country, and there were lots of bears. And of course, the bear trap's about 3 times this big. Once they trapped that animal, they had to stretch the skin. They would turn the animal wrong side out, stretch his skin over a board. They made different size boards. This one is for a raccoon, the old original one. But they'd stretch it over this board. Then they could take and scrape the fat and the meat that was left on the hide off with a tool like this if they were lucky, or just a native natural flint rock like the Indians did it. let that hide dry, then they could make clothes out of it, or they could sell it later. Of course, the rifle was real important. This is about an 1850 rifle made about the period of this cabin. It's called a percussion rifle. And this was made before bullets were invented. You had to pour powder into the barrel, then you had to put a ball in there and tack it down with this called a ramrod. Then you had to have a cap that went on this nipple, and you would, that's how it fired. That cap would make a spark that went down inside there and ignited the powder. Look at these posts. I try to use all the old stuff I can. These posts have quite a history. They've been used before several times, but originally these posts, which are made out of bodark, or Osage yarn, some people call it, or the horseapple tree that has a big green ball. That's the hardest wood in the United States, bodark. It's spelled boise, B-O-I-S-E, D-A-R-C. That's a French word. And some of your first settlers that come in were Frenchmen, because they come in and trapped out of an area and they would move constantly. They didn't settle down like the English or German did. But the French, when they first come to this country, they found the Indians, their bows and arrows that they used, their bows were made out of this wood. So that word, bois d'arc, or bodark, as Texans say, that word in English means bow wood, because the Indians made their bows out of that wood. But it never rots. For hundreds and hundreds of years, probably, nobody really knows. Nobody's ever seen a rotten bodark. But these posts originally were put up in the early 1850s up in Wise County along the old Butterfield stage route. And the Butterfield stage route went from, I believe, St. Louis all the way to California. And along the trail, they put up the first telegraph line that was in this part of the state along that trail. And these trees come off a ranch up in the far northwest corner of Wise County. These were the telegraph poles for that line. These trees were, no telling how old when they were cut, and they've been standing there since about 1851. And I took them down, and I've been using them for porch for my restoration work I do. They'll be here for a few more 100 years. And the chimney, was a real important part of a cabin. That's one of the hardest work there was keeping wood for a chimney. It pretty well took a man full time, because you couldn't let a fire go out in the chimney, in the fireplace, because they didn't have matches back in those days. They wasn't invented yet. And they had to cook 3 meals a day in that fireplace. And they had to use it for light at night. So they never let that fire go out. So it took a lot of wood. It was a full-time job, but it was real important. That chimney was their kitchen. Everything they eat, or the food they dried and put up for winter use, was dried in front of that fireplace. So I went to a local park here where there used to be an old house, and they had used these rocks for flower beds and for everything you can imagine. So I gathered those rocks up. They come from Southlake too. And I built the chimney out of that, because the original chimney was gone. They'd been carried off. But the foundation rock that's under this cabin is the original rock that was under the cabin. Mr. Jack White, when he was real smart man, thought far enough ahead of time to save this rock. He saved the rock. porch of that cabin. These posts are made out of bodark too. I took them off the 460s ranch. The original 460s ranch was in Denton County. And they let me go in there and cut stuff for restoration. And I cut these bodark trees and made these posts exactly the way they would have been. They originally made camfered the post. That's called camfered, these edges, to make them kind of pretty. And then the floorboards are made out of oak, burr oak. These boards are over 20 inches wide from a real big tree, which they originally probably would have done that. The log rafters are all handmade. All the beams have been hand hewed from trees. All the siding was cut from local trees or rescued trees. I try to go around to where they're building housing additions and rescue those trees for restoration. But, this is a little window they put their wood through to feed that fireplace, and the lady did her daily chores here in front of this window for the light. And the nails that are used in this cabin are all square nails, exactly like they would have had. They would have brought them with them, but they didn't use very many of them though. Mostly used wooden pegs. I put wooden pegs back in them to hold these logs up, just like they originally had. And the foundation rock that holds the cabin up, they always built them up off the ground so the air could circulate underneath and keep the logs dry. And one old man said they always did it because that's somewhere for the hogs to get when it was hot. And said they used to play dominoes on weekends, and it was his job as a kid. He had to stand outside with a stick to keep the hogs out from under the house because they'd get to fighting under the house and turn everybody's dominoes over. So, what else?
How about the front porch? Let's go to look at the front door.
Front door? There's not no door.
Well, there's no door yet. There will be. And the steps.
Posted no trespass. A lot of times the windows, they didn't build these cabins at first with windows. They couldn't get glass anyway, so it wouldn't do any good, except for ventilation. But in areas where the Indians were bad and the wild animals were bad, they didn't put windows. They left a solid log going across there, and later on, after Civil War period, they would cut holes for windows. And then in the 1870s, you know, that's mainly when most windows were put in. They could get glass and the Indian troubles were over, and so they'd cut the windows later. And they normally just had shutters over them at first. The ones that could get glass or could afford it later on, then they put glass windows in. But all the hinges on the doors and windows will be wood. You go in. Talk about this stuff between the logs. Back in those days, when they finished the cabin, of course you had big gaps between these logs. They was just, you know, some places there was 6-inch gap. Air would come through. So in the wintertime and the fall, they would put chinking, which is either rock or wood strips, in between the logs. Then they would take local clay that they could find, chop up a little straw or grass and mix with it, and put that mud between the logs to keep the air from blowing through. They did it on both sides. And this clay is from right here in Southlake. It's real good clay. That's the reason Acme brick come to the Denton area and to this country, and then they were, earlier there was a lot of pottery makers in this country from the 1840s through the 1860s, and they come here because of this clay. This clay, once it sets up, is just like a rock. Here's the inside shot of the fireplace. They usually put a rod on these early cabins in there if they had one, if they could get one or bring one with them. They put a rod in here, and then they made these S hooks shaped like an S. They would hang on there and then hang the pot on that. But most of your cooking was done out here on the hearth. The hearth of the fireplace, that's what it's for. They would rake the coals out of there and cook on pots and pans here on the hearth. Because it would get too hot in there, and they could control the heat here by bringing more coal or less coals out here. And then this mantle, it was pretty useful. You know, there'll be hooks here to hang stuff from. They could dry their food, dry their herbs, dry their medicine, whatever they had to put up, dry their meat. But this is made out of that same boat ark I was talking about, bois d'arc, a French word for bowwood. If you look up in here, these log rafters, I had to make those. All the original were gone, but they just took a small oak tree. Everything is oak. All the wood is oak. And they're very strong and very hard and will last forever. But it's all put together, wooden pegs and those, the lath they call it going across, all that's oak. And then those boards go on top of that. But this main beam here that holds all the way to the roof, it was gone. So I had to make these. But all these other logs are original logs. And I found enough of them. This cabin is 16 foot by 16 foot. I found enough logs to make one wall, all logs, going from one end to the other. And normally this was where they would have their beds, and little tables, side tables, if they're lucky enough to have those. Then they would have a kitchen table out in here, near the fireplace, that they had to make by hand. And a few chairs they made by hand. And then the dinner plates would be wood. They had to make everything like that, because glass wouldn't make it on a trip coming in a wagon for about 4 months, beating and banging over rocks and getting in rivers and gullies. I guess we'll see you later.